Today we have a very special guest joining us, Todd Malan. Todd is Chief External Affairs Officer and Head of Climate Strategy at Talon Metals, the majority owner and operator of the high-grade Tamarack Nickel Project in central Minnesota. Todd has responsibility for all external engagement and leads Talon's work on carbon mineralization and ESG product franchise. Todd previously led the corporate relations team for the global mining and metals leader Rio Tinto in the Americas region and globally for the Rio Tinto Aluminum Product Group, where he was a member of the senior leadership team. Before joining the mining and metals sector, Todd was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. If you like what you hear and want to catch past conversations, please make sure to subscribe. And let's dive in. Todd, thanks so much for joining me on The Rocks today, although you are practically on the beach, not The Rocks, because you're in one of my favorite places right now in the whole world, Harbor Island in the Bahamas. So thanks for taking time in a beautiful place to talk to me today.
You bet. Pleased to be here.
So, Todd, I was just about to ask you what you would be drinking.
The traditional drink here on the island is a Goombay Smash. Very, very tasty, but I wanted to keep my wits about me, so I'm having an iced coffee.
Well, hopefully you get to have a Goombay Smash later in the day, at least. I'm really excited to have you on because we got a lot of listener feedback that there's a lot of interest in the topic of critical minerals and what's going on in the mining space around critical minerals from like a resource and availability perspective, but also for the investors. Like, what does it mean? Why should I be paying attention? What do you look for? So I'd love to start by having you give us a little bit of an overview. Like, what does it mean when people talk about critical minerals? Why are they important? And why is everybody all of a sudden paying attention to them?
Yeah, I've been working on critical mineral policy area for almost 10 years now. It's really come to the forefront. We saw President Biden host a session on critical minerals. So it doesn't get more hot than that to have the President of the United States focus on your issue area. Just in general, we think about critical minerals in terms of the critical mineral list that the United States keeps. That list is developed now on a bi-yearly basis, and it's updated on a regular basis. There's a formula that the U.S. Geological Survey puts together that goes into how that list is developed. They just recently added two things that are important. They added nickel and zinc, both of which can have very important roles in the EV battery supply chain and the chemistries of the new batteries. But critical minerals is basically an area where you have a crucial role in an industrial sector or in defense and a problem around security of supply. So it's those two factors that go into an analysis of critical mineral policy is what is absolutely vital that if you lost it in a manufacturing process, the whole thing would come to a halt, just like we're seeing in the supply chain crisis around computer chips. And where do we have vulnerability because we're dependent on one country or a hostile country? And so that forms the sort of Venn diagram around how people then try to focus on certain critical minerals.
And in that sense, when you talk about public policy, it sounds like there are two pathways that would be logical. One would be to increase your domestic supply of those critical minerals, right? And the other would be to identify innovations that maybe would allow you to be less reliant on supplies of specific minerals. Which way is the U.S. administration or kind of global policy going?
So I think there are two other areas that you have to think about. There's collaboration with allies. So ally nations that may have resources in their territory. So in the United States context, in statute, we have the NTIB statute, which actually says that Australia, Canada, and the UK are effectively, for purposes of the defense industrial base of the United States, the 51st, 52nd, and 53rd states. They're treated as if they were the same as the United States. And I think that's really important that when we get down to security supply, that we're thinking about these countries as additional resources of safe and secure supply for things that are on the critical mineral list. Number 4 is you've alluded to this sort of new technological approaches of substitution, actually designing different critical minerals out of a particular manufacturing process. There's really also a fifth one, which is new, which is the ability to actually recycle. I think one of the things that people think about when they think about mining is they draw an analogy over to oil and gas extraction. And one big difference between disturbing the earth to get materials out of the ground that go into the EV batteries is that we've got many of those materials are infinitely recyclable. So you can imagine a scenario where we're taking virgin material out of the ground, hopefully through responsible mining, that goes into a system, and that system actually then can also be recycling. So we can scale up the materials that we need, and they actually are very recyclable. So that's a big difference between fossil fuel, where one time you use it and you lose it, and it obviously harms the environment as well. So there is a big distinction to be drawn here between the oil and gas sector and the mineral sector.
And do you think that that's part of the reason why we see a public policy difference currently, at least here in the US, between support for, domestic mining and maybe a lesser level of support for oil and gas work? There seems to be a more pro-mining approach because people have really recognized, number one, that mining is critical to the low carbon economy of the future, but also, two, that there's a different type of environmental mitigation strategy maybe.
I think people are just waking up to the enormity of the challenge of a conversion to completely electric transportation, for instance, and the amount of material that is going to have to be required to accomplish that task. That if we want to address climate change and we want to switch to electric vehicles and electric transport, that it is going to require a whole new set of minerals and metals. And I think people are recognizing that we can't recycle our way to that. There's not enough material in the system. And now people are starting to think about, okay, then if we're going to have to do this, then what are the responsible standards that we want to do these under?
Yeah, so put your project in context for us, like with all of this going on, because I want to ask you a little bit more in a minute about some of the announcements and kind of the news that's come out, but put what you're doing in the context of this larger new focus.
Sure. So Talon Metals is developing the Tamarack Nickel Project, which is about 45 minutes west of Duluth in Minnesota. It's a very high-grade nickel deposit. We call it the Tamarack Intrusive Complex. So it's about 31,000-acre land package that is a district-scale complex. We have an initial resource identified that in our most recent PEA is fairly well articulated. We're doing more exploration and drilling both of that resource and the whole complex. And we think that ultimately this is a resource that will have multiple future economic mines at the site. But we're developing, a very high grade nickel, cobalt, copper, and platinum group resource. We recently signed an offtake agreement with Tesla in January of this year, which is really exciting. And that will have us supply about 75,000 metric tons of nickel in concentrate. And then Tesla will be processing that further. One of the highlights of the agreement is that it also will encompass some of the byproducts that are in the concentrate. So cobalt, platinum group metals, and iron. So any economic recoveries that come out of the process that Tesla does will also be something that we share the revenue from that. So I think that is also really important so that we're taking a full value mining approach. We're not just taking the nickel, but we're actually recovering all of the other valuable material in the resource.
And you must have seen, I would imagine, differences in when you're dealing with a company like Tesla on an offtake agreement than maybe a more standard mining company buyer-seller relationship. I would imagine that it's got to be a little bit different than who maybe you'd worked with before on other projects.
Yeah, I think it is different. I think that, again, we're the only high-grade nickel deposit in development in the United States right now. There's one other nickel deposit that's being currently mined, which is in Michigan. So that's the Eagle Mine in Michigan, owned by Lundin Mining. Both the Eagle Mine and Tamarack Mine were discovered by the same person my colleague, Dean Rossell. The arrangement with Tesla is really unique. We were allowed by Tesla to call it a partnership, and Drew Baglino made a comment about why they chose to work with us. And we really do view it as a partnership going forward. The auto sector in particular is kind of moving in that direction. So I think Tesla's at the forefront of that, but you can see other auto manufacturers actually not just working with the market, but actually going right to the mine gate to make sure that they have the material they need.
No, I think it has the potential for so many positive changes in the industry to have more of a direct connection or a little bit of a vertical integration between really the manufacturer and the source of the mineral or metal. I mean, number one, in terms of like an understanding of how it works, right? And having the business more aligned, maybe, right? In terms of planning and finance and capital. Sometimes there's a misalignment with the amount of time it takes to bring a mine online and when industry needs the product, especially with specialty minerals or things that are innovation focused. So I'm really excited to see how it moves forward, to see you guys working it as a partnership and what that means and how it progresses.
Yeah, I think the supply chain crisis in chips has really shifted the mindset in the auto sector. I've spoken at a couple of different auto industry events recently, and I think that there is a mind shift away from just-in-time delivery and looking at the automaker as the demandor of exactly what they wanted and what they want to pay for it, and looking more at this partnership model to understand what the mining operation or the recycling operation is dealing with in order to be able to supply exactly what the auto manufacturers need and when they need it.
I also think a cool side benefit is that the supply chain crisis, for lack of a better term, has done more for kind of the not in my backyard than frankly any ESG type of initiative, right? I think a lot of folks have been talking about environmental, social, and governance issues, thinking things like the Dodd-Frank Act, right, would get cobalt mining going in other locations other than conflict countries, for example. And it's like, really, what the world needed to get investment in the US was a supply chain crunch, right? Then everybody wants it in their backyard because they want to know where it is and when it's showing up. But I think it'll have actually a lot of ESG benefits for the industry as a whole, since folks are kind of focusing on more of a nearshore or like an ally type relationship.
I agree with that. I think we're not there yet. I think there is still a lot of not in my backyard. But I think that the more the conversation talks about the purpose and the purpose of why are we disturbing the earth, and that purpose is a noble purpose, which is addressing climate change. The more we can engage people about that, I think that more the auto industry speaks up to engage people about that. I think Jim Farley at Ford recently has made some really interesting and helpful comments for the mining industry, validating that we need more responsible mining in the United States to be able to meet these targets. I think that leaders like President Biden and many people in Congress who have long been talking about these issues is really important. I think that people that have been advocating for electric vehicles for a long time, particularly in the environmental community, are going to have to face up to the challenge that this stuff doesn't grow on trees. And for the environmental and conservation community, you can't have your cake and eat it too, in the terms of, I want everybody to drive an electric vehicle, but I really don't want to even think about where does the material come from. And I've recently watched this show on Netflix called Don't Look Up, which I found really funny. But I think that for the environmental community, for the conservation community, their don't look up moment could be around, oh gosh, I don't even want to think about where the stuff comes from. But I want everybody to have a clean car. If you can't come to a solution about why and how and under what standard we're going to do mining and scale up our recycling system, then you're just telling people don't look up.
If you care about environmental, social, and governance issues, the best place for you to support mining is in your backyard. So you can become an involved and engaged stakeholder, right? And if as a country or as a community, if you don't want it in your backyard, you are ceding some of the control over how that happens to a community that is willing to accept it. And the reality, for me, having worked in a lot of emerging and frontier markets, is a lot of that work then gets pushed to countries where they do not have the ability or perhaps the interest in enforcing really strong environmental, social, and governance rules. So it impacts everybody globally, whether it's in your backyard or not.
And out of sight, out of mind is not an appropriate response to a climate crisis. For those people that just want to say, I don't really care whether it's in Indonesia or Philippines or wherever, then they're really not addressing the serious challenge that we have to protect the climate and change the way that we're addressing climate change.
Yeah. And I also think for folks who are on the investor side who are listening, if you are passionate about the low carbon economy, if you're passionate about renewable energy or electric vehicles, I always say my goal is to convert you, no knock on Tesla, because I know they're your partner, but convert you from being a Tesla investor to being a Talon investor, right? If you want to support the industries that are doing all this cool technology, you can be a really engaged supporter by investing in the mining industry who's pulling out the metal that they need to build all of that cool stuff.
Depending on when you bought Tesla stock, you could probably just double,
Yeah. So on that, if the person listening is an investor, they're hearing all this stuff about critical minerals, what should they look for? If they're looking to invest in a company that's going to be, exploring for or mining for critical minerals, what are some key things they should pay attention to and really make sure to do their due diligence on?
First of all, I think you have to look at the geology. I mean, what sort of grades does a mine operation have? In our case, I think one of the things that is so important about having a high grade nickel deposit is that we can have a smaller mine. We can have that concentration of material, concentration of more good stuff means that we can actually then be more strategic about how we mine that, be more laser focused, disturb the earth less. We're going to have a very small surface disturbance. We'll have basically an adit or an opening in the ground and for vehicles to go in and out of. And we'll be very strategically mining underground. So from the surface, most people won't see a very big operation. So geology is important in terms of the NPV of the project, but it is also important about what sort of social license to operate issues are going to be attendant. Is it going to be a big, giant open mine, or is it going to be a smaller underground operation? Investors really need to kick the tires around what is management doing about earning that social license to operate, because social license to operate is basically the gating issue of whether you're going to be able to get permitted or not. In our case, we're very fortunate that we're on state mineral leases. So we only need state permits. We won't need a federal permit. We're doing everything we can to listen to the community about what their concerns are about mining in the area. It is a traditional mining part of the state, but not the same types of materials, or more iron ore and taconite, but very familiar with mining in the region. And people are interested also in the products that we're producing will now definitively go into EV battery supply chain. There was some question in some people's minds about that. It's now very well established through our Tesla agreement. But I think that investors should also look at what are the management of any company doing to address some very topical questions from people that live in the neighborhood. What are you doing to protect the environment? What are you doing to engage the community in terms of economic benefit sharing? So one of the things that we've done is strike a workforce development agreement with the Steelworkers Union to actually plan for the regional workforce to be developing the right skills for when and if we get a permit and we're up and operating, that we've got the right skills, and that we're actually working with potentially tribal communities to make sure that they have the right skills to be able to apply for these jobs, or even in other parts of the state, in the Twin Cities area, to make sure that there's underrepresented communities that maybe have the ability to go through a skills training program and then be eligible for what will be very well-paid jobs in a very low-cost part of the state. So I think, making, geology and then making sure that there's an ESG strategy that will help the mine to earn its license to operate and to get permitted, I think is a really important thing for all investors to keep in mind.
Oh my gosh, what a great program that is with the workforce development in particular, because, I participate in a lot of discussions wearing my Women in Mining USA hat. And, a top concern that we hear consistently across the industry is trying to attract people to come work in the mining industry, right? Domestically here in the US, but globally, there's a workforce shortage, and young people in particular trying to kind of pull new people in. That's a really creative solution to how do you get folks involved and help them see these are great, in many cases, very high tech, innovative jobs, technical, well-paying jobs. It's not what people picture when they kind of think, West Virginia coal miner from the 1920s, right? I mean, the industry looks very different as an employer now than how people imagine it.
Yeah. And the other thing about our agreement with the steelworkers is that we're going to look at parts of the country where there may be people that have mining skills, but because of winding down coal operations or other things, they may need some retraining, for an underground setting or different types of technology. But we'd like to try and pull in people that have mining experience in West Virginia or North Dakota or other parts of the country, are looking to continue their mining career, but need help with different skill sets. So we're quite hopeful that that'll be a part of what our legacy is that we're actually helping people to extend their careers.
Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit. There's been so much news going around. You referenced some announcements that came out of the U.S. White House, but also you all have been making announcements. So give us kind of a snapshot of all the stuff that's been going on, because as you and I talked about earlier, it's almost a little hard to keep track of it all because it's moving so quickly.
For people that have been sort of focused on critical mineral policy and supply chains that matter in the EV space, we're kind of the dog that caught the bus, because now after the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed and there's over $3 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for critical minerals processing, battery recycling operations. There's new money coming out at DOD, DOE. It's really hard to keep track, but it's really exciting. And I think that the President of the United States actually taking time out and to actually focus on critical minerals policy, talk about what his administration wants to set as the standards for new responsible mining in the United States. I think we have to just celebrate that and win and recognize that hasn't always been the case. So there may be things that people can, in the mining sector that point out different inconsistencies and, different decisions. But I think that now that the president has actually made this a priority, it gives us an opportunity to engage with officials and to engage with Congress and remind people that what we're doing is we're part of the solution for the climate crisis. If people want to talk about the standards under which we produce materials in the United States, I think we should welcome that.
Again, having worked for the federal government as part of the DoD for several years and talking about mining and even some strategic or critical minerals way back then, specifically looking at rare earth supply and some assets in Afghanistan and trying to have conversations with the interagency around why it's important to understand where rare earths and other deposits are globally. It's amazing how far the U.S. government has come in terms of the level of understanding on the basic technical nature of what it means, right, and what it is, and why it's so important, and the increasing complexity geopolitically of how all this stuff fits together. I mean, you and I are recording this in the context of sanctions coming out regarding the Ukraine and Russia conflict, right, and kind of uncertainty day to day on what that means and where China falls. Right, things are getting really complex very quickly, and yet the government is making strides in terms of understanding this is a priority and not losing sight of that despite a lot of other stuff going on. And historically, we, the U.S., have bashed other countries, China in particular, that they dominate the space. And it's like, well, I was telling you earlier, if you want to win, you got to at least get on the field. So I personally feel like, okay, we're getting on the field, right? The U.S. is ready to play. And at least from a domestic secure supply chain perspective, we're ready to protect our interests and make sure we understand our role in this larger space. So I see it as only positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And the door has been opened at the top of the government to have this conversation. So if people want to also talk about practical changes to permitting to make it easier to permit mines while not cutting any corners on environmental protection, but maybe just doing basic interagency coordination on permitting schedules, there are some things that can be done that still remain faithful to the desire to protect the environment and the need to protect the environment while also limiting undue delay.
Yeah, and I think it's always worth reminding people who are new to the industry that, in my experience at least, there are very few people who work in mining who don't love the environment, right? You don't get into geology if you don't like to wander around in the middle of nowhere looking at rocks, right? I mean, we're about kind of close to those issues, and by far, most folks really are intending and wanting to be good stewards of the earth, right? And of the resources, and really understand what's at risk. That doesn't mean that everything goes right or that all the players are honest and good, but in general, the industry does want to do this the right way and make sure that we're accountable.
And I think that that's one of the things that the environmental community and the conservation community shouldn't be too quick to dismiss, that people are coming to this discussion in good faith and really do want to do everything they can to protect the natural environment. In our instance, we have over 65 people in the town of Tamarack or in the region. Many of them grow up there, and they're sometimes offended by some of the people who, may fly into their lake house and then finger wag about, protecting the environment when people live there all year round. And I think that sort of stepping back and understanding where people are coming from is also something that isn't something that just the mining sector needs to do, but so do, traditional mining opponents or other people that are focused on the environment. They need to actually give people some credit for also caring about the environment as well.
Yeah, I grew up in rural Maine, and we had a lot of the same dynamic, right? Where with a really strong forestry economy, as well as fisheries and lobster, a lot of essentially resource-based economic activity, there was always that dynamic that the number of bumper stickers you would see in Maine that said, if you're anti-logging, good luck with your toilet paper. There are lots of different issues where stakeholder involvement can take different shapes, right, in different conversations. But it's always important for so many reasons to take into consideration employment, right? Employment is a big deal, and creating job opportunities is a social and governance initiative, right? It's a big deal for communities that may not have other industries coming in.
Yeah, it's got to be part of what we have the conversation about what our value proposition to society is, jobs and economic benefit. But we have to also answer the question, well, what are you doing to protect the environment? What's your product going into? It's very current to be able to say, hey, listen, this is the stuff that is going to make the electric transition possible. And I'm finding that in our conversation with the community, people are really finding that to be interesting, to draw that linkage and to have, their kids actually think about, okay, this is a job that has a purpose.
Sure. And is part of the future of our country and the world, right? I mean, it fits into a much larger vision and picture.
We have been doing some work over the last year with our JV partner, Rio Tinto, on the potential for our deposit to actually be a carbon storage location through the natural reaction between ultramafic rocks and sequestered carbon. We're really excited. We were just granted a $2 million grant from the Department of Energy's ARPA-E Innovation Challenge from last year. So our project will be in total $6.2 million, 2.2 from DOE and 4 from Rio Tinto, to look at the potential for the Tamarack intrusive complex to be a major storage capability for carbon that's been captured either through point source carbon capture or direct air capture, which is more carbon removal. But we think we could have the potential at Tamarack to store hundreds of millions of tons of sequestered carbon and lock that away permanently in stone form through that natural chemical reaction. So we'll be doing studies over the next 3 years on that. I think that's important for a couple of different reasons. One is it's great to see the mining industry have a role in carbon storage, sequestration, and removal. We have some unique capabilities in that area, and we shouldn't just cede that to oil and gas, who have been the traditional industry that started to think about carbon capture and storage. But I also think for many projects, this may be new line of revenue. So you may have projects that are at the line of their, NPV, but when you take into account the potential to store carbon, get subsidies from government, sell offsets into the private market, the voluntary market, it could be a whole new line of revenue. And we're certainly looking at that at Tamarack, that this could be a new line of revenue for us that goes along with the high grade nickel that we've got in the deposit. So I'm really excited about this part of the story for Tamarack.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting for two reasons. One, I don't think most folks are aware or maybe understand how that chemical reaction works. So I'd love to have you explain that. But also on the NPV side, we've talked a little bit about this on the podcast, the net present value of the project, right, is what NPV means. And at Prospector, we've actually been building an NPV calculator so that investors can easily compare and play around, right? If variables change, assumptions change, what does that do to the NPV or the value of that project? And how fascinating would it be to be able to add in like a carbon component to that, right? And what a difference that would make, I'm sure, and unique to certain projects, right? So how does that work? How does the actual kind of science, or maybe it's still theoretical to a certain extent?
It's pretty well established. There's been a lot of people working on that for a very long time. It's just now that it's become kind of commercially viable. So you have probably the leading company in this area is a company called CarbFix up in Iceland, where they have for almost 10 years now been doing studies about the ability to take carbonated water and actually inject it into basaltic rocks. And they've proven that they can put Y amount of carbon in the water, inject it into the ground, and over a period of time, 6 months to a year, they can prove they come up with X amount of carbon in mineralized form. There's a company in Oman called 4401 that's doing very interesting work in this same area. The Pacific Northwest National Lab out in Washington State has done a very similar thing to what Iceland is doing with basaltic rocks. We don't have basalts. We're an ultramafic deposit. We have the right kind of rocks that will react with carbon, both in our primary deposit. So our tailings will be able to be carbonated. Then either in the dry stack tailings, you could actually think of the dry stack tailings as a carbon sink. And then we'll also have to create cemented material to go back in the mine, and that can be carbonated. There's lots of companies working with different types of formulations of cement to capture carbon inside that cement. Lastly, in our deposit, we actually have a very large bowl area that is composed of olivine sand. So highly porous, highly reactive with carbon. And we think this sand area, which is at a deep depth, well below, the regular aquifers, has the prospect of actually reacting with the carbon, locking that away in permanent form. And I think that for the private offset market, carbon mineralization is at the top of the list, because if you think of people like Microsoft or Stripe investing in forests, they've done that over the last 5 or 6 years to create carbon offsets for their historic carbon emissions. Well, you have a forest fire, you lose all that. You put carbon in a saline aquifer and there's a terrible earthquake and it all goes up in the atmosphere in 20 years. Who do you sue in that instance, and over the lost value of that offset? Carbon mineralization is X amount of carbon goes into the ground, Y amount of carbon captured permanently in stone form. So I think there's some really interesting aspects for that private ESG investing market in carbon mineralization. And I think that, Rio Tinto is really at the forefront of working on this on a global basis. But the first work that they'll be doing with us is going to be at Tamarack in Minnesota.
No, that is so exciting. And I mean, I understand certainly the science behind it, but in my mind, it just kind of looks like Sprite, like bubbles going through rocks. I mean, it's a fun thing to think about, but I love how forward thinking it is, because most laymen think of mining as a carbon producing industry, right? But how can we flip that around and actually contribute to the solution? I'm really excited to continue following what you guys are doing. On that note, I've been asking all of my guests lately, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the mining industry, what would you change?
I think the mining industry has a long way to go in terms of diversity and inclusion in employment at all levels, from boards to management to the workforce. I think that we need to really redouble our efforts to think about what are the ways that we can bring new people with new perspectives, women, communities that traditionally haven't participated in mining. So in our area in Minnesota, I think of, potential employees in the tribal community. I think the refugee communities in the Twin Cities areas are all hardworking people that just may not have thought about the mining sector, may not have thought about the skill sets, thought about a lifelong career that can be made from getting the right skills to be in very high paying jobs in the mining sector. And then in terms of leadership, I think just people with different backgrounds, different aspects of life, whether that's women, different nationalities, people from the LGBT community. I think that we've got to be thinking about more pushing intent around diversity, that the companies will be stronger if they have a more diversified management and workforce.
No, I think that's so spot on. You're warming my Women in Mining USA heart to hear that. But I think it's especially important for companies like yours that are looking at the future of the industry, right? And if you're going to be planning for and developing the future or the mines that our future requires, your company has to reflect the future that you want to have and want to see, right? And that means participation and leadership from diverse walks of life. I'm a big believer that our industry, just at a basic level, needs people to come in who have worked in other industries. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on the rocks. And I hope to see you in person soon, and great luck with everything going on. We really look forward to keeping up to date with the project and all of your great momentum. Thank you to our guest and my colleague, Todd Malan, for joining us on this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about Todd and his work, visit him on LinkedIn and at his company's website, talonmetals.com. For more insights on new mining projects, mining news, and more, go to our website at prospectorportal.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Nugget. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. If you enjoyed the episode, click the subscribe button and leave us a review. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold. Cheers. Outro take 2.